produces enough food to feed about 10.5 billion people with a B. And we have only about 7.1 or 7.2 billion people in the world. So all that food for more than 7.2 billion people just goes to the tip, gets destroyed. It just gets...
So unfortunate.
Here in Canberra, we waste something like 100 tonnes a week of food that just goes straight to get buried at a landfill dump.
It's possible.
And it produces huge amounts of methane in the dump. If it's just allowed to rot in the dump, it will produce large quantities of methane that some tips are now tapping into and getting the gas out of that. Like in Seoul in Korea, South Korea, they have the largest tips in the world, and they're actually collecting...
South Australia?
Seoul in South Korea.
South Korea, all right.
They have the largest tips in the world, and they have a huge factory in between the two big piles of garbage which collects the gas, and they actually run the whole bus fleet of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, with gas from the tips.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and there's a government agency that actually is responsible for doing that, collecting the gas, running the factory, organising all the things to go in. But here in Canberra, we waste about 100 tonnes of food a week into the dump. It goes straight to the tip, into the garbage.
Oh my God.
And we need to have something like in France, where there's a law that was passed only recently that said that before a supermarket can just throw good food into the big bins to go to the tip, they have to work out ways of being able to distribute that to some of the people who are going hungry, the homeless people, charities and things like that. So I do a lot of food rescue as part of the whole food security strategy that I'm involved in, that includes composting and actually rejuvenating soils that we have completely destroyed, taking the nutrient out, taking the bacteria out, taking all the living organisms out of the soil, and they're now in a situation where they will not grow very good food. Either the nutrients going to be low or whatever. But yeah, I mean, so we have about 1 billion, 2 billion people going hungry around the world, and we're throwing out enough food for about 3 or 4 billion people. It just doesn't make sense.
What a tragedy.
And the worst thing about it is that most governments see that it's a priority to worry about defence. How many people can you kill rather than how many people can you feed?
Exactly. Very much correct.
And it's such a big difference. It's a sort of a whole different way of thinking. Instead of worrying about what they call the defence people call the pointy end, how many people can this missile destroy, and like we heard about the Tomahawk missiles that were launched by the US recently into Syria. They cost, just the missile itself was $1 million each. So they put 59 missiles in. I think 60 they fired. One went into the sea, but everyone's quiet about that. So that's just $60 million for the missiles alone, for one attack on an airport that did nothing apart from just making a political point. That the US, president now, Donald Trump, is a strong man, and that he can throw missiles around the place. He can press the red button, but he didn't even know that they'd fired the missiles. This is the crazy thing about it. Apparently, he just said that he gave power to defence to do whatever they wanted to do. So, if we don't get that change in governments all around the world to work together to actually embrace looking after people, and
people doesn't have the statistics. That the statistics you provided, I didn't have that information. Living in Canberra, it's it's a ton a week or something like that. 1 ton a week. 1 ton.
100 tons a week.
100 tons a week.
100 tons, yes.
I put it in the bin.
My trailer is able to carry half a ton. In the free trips I've made for this gathering, which is a storytelling thing for Indigenous people here in Australia, I think I probably rescued about a half a tonne from that 100 tonnes.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So about half percent of 1 week's food.
So how did you get the statistics? You got it from, you did that research?
I do a lot of work on food security. I helped write the Greens ACT policy on food security here in ACT. And it's now actually we're starting to get somewhere, because what we're hoping to do is actually have supermarkets somehow or other encouraged to run community gardens, say in their car parks, and have their shop workers to actually think about taking people who come into their store, come in and have a look at our community garden. We've got these things growing here and all that, and they actually employ people to help grow that garden. But at the same time, if they're adopting their current corporate business plan, which is to have the shelves full of food to make everyone who comes into the store feel happy, so they'll buy more. It doesn't always work that way. People have been told that if they have a piece of fruit like this pear and it's got a bit of a brown blemish on it, that's no good. But when you cut it open, it's still quite white inside, and you can still get a lot of good fruit out of it. So
that's true. I missed that one. That's wonderful, So that's good. That's correct. We'll pick up another one. I mean, that's very interesting.
So a lot of people go into the stores and they're actually convinced that if they have a little spot on it or something like, oh, that's no good, you can't do anything with that. But if you just cut that spot off, there's nothing underneath it at all. It's perfectly white, perfectly good to eat. It's just a skin, and it's just because it's been bruised in transport or something like that. And that's half our problem, is we transport food with food miles, and the impact that has on the climate change or the climate crisis we've got growing in our midst. The food miles, the amount of diesel they use, the amount of fuel they use to transport the stuff can involve thousands of miles. And if we can get the stuff locally and grow it locally, like around supermarkets, and supermarkets then become part of a community thing rather than just how can we make money from people who come into our store.
Exactly. That's the profit monger. Always the target is focused in the profit, how to make profit.
That's right.
I mean, as the other day, the speakers were telling, they are selling the arms not for our security. They are selling arms just to get money out of it. They are bringing more issues, conflict all over the world, particularly Middle East, just to sell more their arms, expensive arms.
Exactly. These wars that are being waged around the area, and walls that they're building to prevent refugees from moving place to place, the wars are actually creating the refugees.
Exactly.
If you have your neighbourhood completely demolished by bombs and
what they will do,
and conflict in those areas, you're not going to want to live there very long. You want to move on to find somewhere else where you can actually bring your families up.
And maybe one stage they might get into your house. So you cannot tell them you are the aggressor or terrorist,
That's right.
Because they need to leave,
Yeah.
So how people are taking a lot of risk and coming to the other country, going to the country. Even what about us? What about the initial immigration? People come from the England, from other countries, they moved here, and they have a problem and they moved here. They're not terrorists. They came here to settle, A
lot of people here in Australia probably know the what they used to call the 2 bob poms.
Mm-hmm.
That's the English people could come to Australia and all they had to pay was 2 shillings or 20 cents. And that would give them passage to Australia. They didn't have to worry about language or, they spoke English, or the values. Like we now have a values test for people come to Australia. But, my parents came to Australia and they didn't know a word of English. They knew a couple of slang words and things like that. And when my father worked in the factories, he just knew how to swear his head off.
Exactly.
That's the English that the Australians taught him.
True.
So if that's the values that Australians expect newly arrived migrants into Australia.
Now they're changing the rules. That 457.
That's right.
They have to go through the English. They have to interview and ask a lot of questions.
You have to know which football team.
As a football team,
it's just
this is crazy.
Or who was the most famous cricketer. No, I've never followed cricket or football or anything. I wouldn't have a clue blue.
Exactly.
You know, so, they better deport me.
Yeah, exactly. True. Even it's a lot of countries. Even Australian, they are living 50, 60 years. They do not know a lot of places here. They cannot answer a lot of questions. I was in America and I have talked to a few people. They do not know about how many states they have, how many cities they have. They haven't been there. So these are
I think
questions.
the worst thing, when you have conflict areas, we talked a bit about wars and so on around the world and battlegrounds and conflict areas. Many of those people who escape their ruined neighbourhoods, their ruined communities that have been demolished by random bombing and terrorist groups and whatever, or they could be government troops doing the same thing, just demolishing things so it's easier to find what they call the enemy. They've got very little to go with them. It's usually whatever they can pack into a bag and get out of there. So they won't have documents. The documents would have been destroyed in their homes.
Exactly, true.
My parents came to Australia. They were boat people in 1949 after the war-torn Europe.
Yes.
And they had nothing left. They could go back to their country in Poland, but it was taken over by a different country altogether, a completely different sort of government, and they had ruins.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you go and live in a pile of rubble?
True.
And they couldn't go back, so they said, well, we've got to go somewhere. America wouldn't let them in. Australia had a rule that they only wanted people who were literate coming to Australia. So it was very difficult, because like my dad, he lived through the whole war with no schooling. He was only a little kid when the war broke out, and then by the end of the war, which lasted, from 1914 to 1917, he missed out on education, so he was not literate. But he had to pass a literacy test.
Wonderful. I mean, actually, we need to talk about, particularly about the food security. I will have a chat again with you. But it's very important information. I heard when I was a student of the university, and I heard that the rich country, they throw the rice and wheat on the sea, deep sea, so they can keep the price, sell it.
Of course,
you know about it.
Dumping, yeah.
Dumping. They dump foods.
There's two ways of referring to there's dumping where you dump poor products. They may be contaminated with pesticides or something like that, and they're being dumped in certain countries that don't have regulations to prevent that sort of thing from happening. The other sort of area where food is being dumped is to keep the prices high. Food and military agricultural system relies on
sometimes they stock it. Hoarding, hoarding? Stock.
Yes. Yeah.
This happens in my country.
Yeah.
And many other countries, they stock it. The rich people, they stock rice and make a artificial crisis and raise the price. Not a price of the food grain or anything, That happens to every products. Because the business people are focused on making money, profit.
Yes.
Not to help people, just to make money, greed.
And this is where I think most national defence establishments need to think seriously about, rather than how many people does this missile or weapon kill, is how can we use our military hardware, not the things that blow up, the bombs and the weapons and the ammunition and stuff like that, but how can we use some of the engineering equipment they have, the trucks, the planes, the big caribou carrier transport planes, the ships, to distribute the food from the places where it is overproduced to countries that actually need it. Now, wouldn't that stop a war if people have got full bellies, feeling happy, like the people who wander into these, plush supermarkets here in Canberra? That would stop a war, which means you wouldn't have to spend $1 million to fire a missile to scare someone off.
Exactly.
And it's actually an investment that nations can do to help other nations out. But I think our sort of whole thinking is starting to get really skewed since the recent politics that have happened in the US.
Everyone has sort of gone,
dimension
is changing now.
Greed, selfishness, and
It has gone up.
apathy.
It has gone up actually.
Yes.
I mean, rather very insecure. People all over the world are feeling very insecure.
There are scientists now saying that our biggest problems that we're going to face on the science front is not the science of climate change, but it's the science of greed, selfishness, and apathy.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do we fix that in the populations around the world so that they don't feel they have to be frightened of someone else because they look a bit different, or they've come from a different place, or they speak a different language, or they have a different culture. Their art's different.